All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here with us. My name is Ellen Hyman. I'm Penn Law's Environmental Law Project's Director of Events. So excited to be here with our brilliant candidate or panelists who have been, sorry for the background noise, who have been so generous with their time and are willing to join us. I have a quick announcement about CLE credit. If you are seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that CLE codes will be announced twice during the event through like a poll function. Write down those codes and be sure to enter them in your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credit. The link to the digital evaluation form was emailed to you in your confirmation email. If you did not receive the email, please link to the evaluation form in the chat. The codes will be able to tell CLE how long you've attended, etc. So with that, I'll kick it over to Sage, who is our moderator, to get the event started.
Great, thank you so much, Ellen. Hi, everyone. My name is Sage, and I'm a first-year law student and a member of the Environmental Law Project here at Penn. Thank you all for joining us today. I know I can speak on behalf of everyone in attendance that I say we're really excited for today's conversation. And today, we're hoping to learn more about how climate justice really goes hand in hand with racial justice, and how in order to combat climate change, we must also grapple with America's history of colonialism, white supremacy, racism, and sacrifice zones like Louisiana's Cancer Alley, among others much closer to home here in Philadelphia. Our four panelists are really experts in this area, and they'll share their valuable perspectives and what I really hope will be a free-flowing conversation. We'll start out hearing introductions from our panelists, and then we'll dive into how their work relates to environmental racism, how the mainstream environmental movement has harmed communities of color, and how this is or isn't being addressed in modern climate policies. We'll also discuss what lawyers can and should be doing to advance racial and climate justice. And we'll have time at the end for an open question and answer. So please feel free to put any questions in the question block at the bottom there, and we'll try to get through as many as we can at the end. So without further ado, thank you to our panelists. And I'll let you introduce yourselves. Ebony, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here and speaking with you today. My name is Ebony Griffin. I am a staff attorney at the Public Interest Law Center, where I focus on environmental justice. I represent community organizations and gardens in Philadelphia around a host of environmental justice issues, including land access, air quality, and water quality, as well as negotiating community benefits agreements around development in communities and things like that.
Great. Zakia, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Zakia Elliott. I use she, her pronouns, and I work with the Sierra Club Pennsylvania chapter as the program manager of Philadelphia Climate Works. Philadelphia Climate Works is a local coalition uniting community activists, labor unions, environmental allies to move the city to build climate resilience through equitable investments in the community and workforce. So we bring these folks together to discuss the ways that climate change impacts our lives and to build strategies to mitigate those harms. And we focus on a range of issues from diesel pollution and transit equity to housing disrepair, energy burdens, and health and safety hazards from waste collection. Thank you.
Thanks, Zakia. Melissa, would you like to go?
Thank you. It's great to be here. My name is Melissa Yashan. I graduated from Penn Law in 2006, and I am currently Senior Supervising Counsel in the Environmental Justice Program at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. New York Lawyers for the Public Interest is a civil rights community lawyering nonprofit where we use the trifecta, I like to call it, of community organizing, legislative advocacy, and impact litigation to try and rectify a lot of the systemic harms that have disproportionately impacted disadvantaged communities, communities of color, low-income communities here in New York City. In particular, we work to rectify the harms caused by the unjust and unfair siting of polluting infrastructure in New York City. And I look forward to talking about our work and bigger issues with all of these incredible panelists who I get to talk with today.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Amy Laura?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. So I am a 2009 Penn Law grad, where I was a co-founder of the Environmental Law Project, which is one of the reasons I'm delighted to be here. Coming out of Penn Law and after clerking for a couple of years, I actually was at the Public Interest Law Center for 6 years as a staff attorney working on EJ issues before I handed the baton or the flame or whatever off to Ebony, who's been holding it down ever since then, to my enormous delight. So since 2017, I've been at the Conservation Law Foundation, which is an environmental legal nonprofit serving all of New England. And since 2018, I have led our environmental justice work, really increasingly centering racial justice, community and place-based partnership, and systems change on a range of environmental and climate justice issues. I'm in my last week at CLF, and I just started teaching climate policy at Tufts in the Urban and Environmental Studies program, and I am headed to Vermont Law School on Monday as a visiting professor to lead the Environmental Justice Clinic. So it's a moment of a lot of change right now, but still so deeply committed to this work and looking for an opportunity really to at the intersection of civil rights and EJ.
Great, well, thank you so much for being here. To start out with, we kind of wanted to give the audience a sense about how environmental racism, the background of it, and how its impacts really play out. So along those lines, to get a sense of different ways that environmental racism affects communities and our justice system, would you guys be able to talk about how racism and other forms of systematic oppression have either directly caused or contributed to some of the issues that you've worked on during your careers? And I'll just let whoever wants to pop in start speaking.
I can go. So environmental racism is, as many have stated before me, it's not by accident. You know, we don't see these environmental justice problems popping up in Philadelphia and other cities throughout the country just because things happen to be that way. It is by design, and it is a form of structural and systemic racism that needs to be eradicated. And I believe, you know, one of the most frustrating things about my work is making people who are sort of working on the other side of these environmental issues realize that fact, that environmental racism, environmental injustice is not an accidental occurrence, and it is embedded and deeply embedded in, you know, the laws that we have throughout this country, throughout existing regulations, throughout policy, throughout land use requirements and things like that. And it goes back, you know, even farther than redlining, but it's still as pervasive. And, you know, it's really important that people recognize that fact, because the longer it takes for us to get to the point of acknowledging that it is not an accidental occurrence, the longer it's going to take for us to really get to the root cause and start fixing the issue.
I really have to agree with Ebony here. My focus is on climate and environmental justice, and I always say that it requires racial and economic justice, and that we really have to interrogate the ways that racism and classism has really embedded itself into the policies that we're still using today and that we need to dismantle right now. Also, a focus that I tend to bring folks' attention to is just the ways that we really need to lift up everyday people as experts, and by bringing in their lived experiences and really forcing the city and institutions and other decision makers to really focus on how to listen and how to use the knowledge of what people have experienced to actually dive deeper into how we can, one, understand the history of how we got here, and then two, really figure out how we can affect change. And so that's a reason why I do focus on coalition building, right? How do we build power with people? How do we use different tools, one tool being law, to actually advance environmental and climate justice?
I want to echo something that Ebony said, which was this predates redlining. and then come back to redlining, which is to say, everything that we're looking at right now in terms of the systematic withholding of environmental and climate benefits and the disproportionate burdens placed on Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities really goes back to the origins of this country and the dehumanizing and devaluing of Black people in the U.S. and Indigenous people in the U.S. and immigrants and refugees and poor people, and at the same time, and now I have this passcode in my view, and so much of this has been reinforced through segregation and through housing segregation, through redlining, and through federal, state, and local policies around housing. We at Conservation Law Foundation, we're completing a study looking at cumulative burdens, transportation burdens, climate burdens, so air quality, transportation access, heat island effect, access to evacuation from flooding and the flood impacts themselves. And what we're seeing is the concentration, not just of one set of burdens, but of burden upon burden upon burden on those communities that are predominantly people of color and predominantly people with limited English proficiency. And it's really about, it is so stark to see that areas that have been subject to segregation are the areas that are bearing not one, but sets upon sets of burdens. And at the same time, we, in trying to advocate for environmental justice legislation in Massachusetts, specifically, we have had to fight so hard to have race be acknowledged in that legislation as one factor in determining how burdens and benefits are allocated, because there's such a resistance to addressing environmental racism head on.
So just to jump on all of the amazing things that everyone said, and I think Amy Laura, you know, talking about all of the sort of causes and naming them of the historic, systemic, persistent racism that is in all of our systems, and especially and particularly what we're talking today about our, you know, environmental vulnerabilities, burdens, and benefits. The phrase in the question that was used is sacrifice zones. And that's something that Amy Laura and I worked together a lot this past summer during the height of the COVID pandemic. I think this concept of sacrifice zones really came to the forefront, and people who weren't necessarily familiar with what that means became a little bit more familiar. Why was the COVID pandemic hitting some communities so much harder than others? And why were these communities, the, you know, BIPOC communities, that were being hit hardest? And it's because these are what our nation has for centuries deemed sacrifice zones. This is where we cluster our burdens. This is where our access to infrastructure and healthcare is much lower than other places. And then with all of the other reckonings we're seeing in our country, it's the same sacrifice zones. The same communities in New York City that have the highest asthma rates are the same communities that have the highest incarceration rates, the same communities that are over polluted or over policed. And that's actually that sort of reckoning and the awareness of these sacrifice zones has actually led to a lot of, I would say, evolution and growth and power in the environmental justice movement in a way of aligning with other movements that have long held lots of activism and power. And in New York City, one of those ways, and I will use this as an excuse if you see me checking my phone, we have formed an unprecedented coalition called the Renewable Rikers Coalition. And this came out of the movement to close Rikers Island, which is the last standing penal colony in the United States. It is an island built over a decomposing landfill in the middle of a bay surrounded by polluting infrastructure. It is where poor Black and brown individuals who are arrested are sent while they await trial because they cannot afford to pay bail. It is a debtor's island. It is toxic. The conditions of confinement there are abhorrent and in violation of all civil rights. And there has been a strong movement to close this penal colony for a very long time. Why did we join? We joined as an environmental justice program to add to the urgency by pointing to the environmental conditions and harms that the detainees on the island face, but also because we believe that this landmass of 413 acres can actually be a key to the future of New York City for sustainability, and can cite in sustainable infrastructure, create new jobs, which could then be made available to people who have returned home from incarceration. So that vision has put together survivors of Rikers, directly impacted individual, environmental justice organizations and communities, as well as advocates in the same coalition for the first time. And we are supposed to be passing our 3 bills, the Renewable, Rikers Act, and New York City Council, a week from tomorrow, which means they have to be finalized today, which is why I'm getting texts and emails and calls trying to finalize language. But this is an example of how the recognition of sacrifice zones, the same communities who have been so impacted by the legacy of Rikers and over-incarceration, mass incarceration, and police brutality in New York City, are the same communities who stand to benefit from the removal of fossil fuel infrastructure and investment in renewable energy infrastructure on Rikers Island.
Thank you so much, everyone, for those really powerful words. So Melissa, I think the example you gave was a wonderful example of how we really see how, focus on environmental justice can really intersect with these other really important issues. But for a long time, environmental justice has been really separate from environmentalism, and the two have often been at odds. I was wondering if all of the panelists could speak about how you've seen this distinction really play out in the legal field, in different courts and cases, and in your practice in general.
Can I talk about market-based solutions for a minute?
We're gonna get there later, but go right ahead. Yeah.
So one of the things that I think it's really has been that this is a pattern that sort of predates the climate movement, but has been really very visible in the climate movement, which is, because of this sense of urgency around the climate crisis, there is this sense that, justice is sort of secondary, that we need to deal with, that we have this sort of pending, looming climate crisis. And so we need to deal with that by mitigating the effects and adapting to the impacts. And then we'll get justice down the line, but that we don't have time to deal with justice issues. And which, functionally means we don't have time to include the people most impacted by the climate crisis, by the impacts, the negative impacts of the climate crisis, and the people who are probably most affected by the solutions in terms of kind of the potential burdens even of the solutions themselves in the conversation in terms of how we shape policy. And so there's been a pattern, I call it patterns of behavior. There's been a pattern of behavior in the environmental and climate movements for some years of really marginalizing people of color, immigrant and refugee communities, and poor people, indigenous people from the process of creating policy. We saw this in California around the cap and trade policies. We saw this around the Clean Power Plan. We saw this in 2008 when we were looking at potential national legislation on cap and trade that did not come to fruition. And then I have watched this firsthand for the past 3+ years in conversations around creating a regional market-based transportation and climate initiative that would kind of put a cap on transportation emissions and create a set of allowances and kind of ramp down transportation emissions, which is something that we desperately need to do. Transportation emissions are 40% of the region's greenhouse gas emissions. It's a huge contributor to climate change. It also has enormous impacts on air quality in environmental justice communities. So if you if you center racial justice, you say, okay, alongside, alongside enacting policies that ramp down emissions, you can and should prioritize improving air quality in the communities that need that the most. And there has, for the 10 plus years that what we call TCI, Transportation and Climate Initiative, has been in conversation for many years, no advocates were in the room. It was just state policymakers. But then once the sort of door opened to conversations with advocates, there was a real, not just an exclusion of people of color, but of issues of justice and of, just a real unwillingness to kind of take a step back. And part of that pattern of behavior is a sort of trope of white supremacy, which is the notion of false urgency. And that, and the kind of flip side of this is that if you create community-driven processes and have more inclusive tables, then you have policies that are informed by the people who are most impacted by these issues. And we really need to change our behavior as a set of movements to learn how to do that, because the results will be not just more just, but actually more successful and better overall.
Amy, I'm so glad that you brought up TCI. That has been a huge issue within the Sierra Club, a traditional environmental organization that has caused a lot of tensions between local organizers who do have relationships with environmental justice organizations, and really trying to figure out this tension between the outcome and the process and how we get there. And I feel that's really where we see this divorce from environmentalism and environmental justice. We really need to focus on the process and not so much of the outcome. The outcome being that we do want to see less emissions. We do want to advance more sustainable practices, but at what cost and who is included in that decision making. So that was definitely something that we were grappling with. Something that I was a part of recently that also brings this to mind is there's a national wave around building electrification, right? So how are we going to meet our climate goals without figuring out how to electrify everything, including our buildings, our homes? And some of these conversations between cities were happening years before this, cities really coming together to figure out in our, with the challenges that we individually have, how can we make this happen? And one group joined those initial conversations and realized that they were the only organization that really had diverse staff in different cities, the Emerald Cities Collaborative, and they just took it upon themselves to start coordinating the environmental justice organizations into having conversations around electrification and what those impacts would be on residents, on workers, on entire communities. And so I was a part of those initial conversations, and building electrification remains one of the priority areas for me to pull together folks to talk about how we advance building electrification, but having to center the issues that we're already dealing with, which include the need for housing repair, right? And the fact that there are people who do not have safe housing, who are struggling with their energy bills. And so how do we deal with these issues that are disproportionately impacting low income and Black and brown communities, and knowing that they need to be centered first in order for any of these policies to be done well. And then I just also think of traditional environmental issues like solar or electric vehicles, and how those just prioritize people who have the income to make those changes individually. And we need to move beyond relying on individual actions and start thinking of how can we make changes that could benefit everyone, instead of focusing on supporting individual car owners to be able to purchase electric vehicles and get a car charging station. For example, Philadelphia had a car parking program for electric vehicle owners, but actually start focusing on how do we transform our entire fleet, right? How do we focus on electric buses? Why don't we think about the bus depots and where they're located and how they're all in environmental justice areas, and really starting to decenter these outcomes and start thinking about what the real outcomes need to be, right? We need to start focusing on how do we reduce these huge impacts on the most impacted people.
I'm going to jump in really quickly to just say, I just want to point out, as someone who's not in Sierra Club, to just kind of raise up something that Sierra Club just did, which is to kind of to take a second look at a policy position that you all had on TCI and say, okay, we are being asked specifically by people of color led organizations to reevaluate that, and y'all did it. And that's one of those things that I think it's sometimes really hard for NGOs or specifically or policymakers to do, is to say, oh wait, at what point do we actually stop a moving train and say, okay, we really need to reevaluate and listen and take some time. So kudos.
I know a lot of members of the audience today are from Philly or living in Philly currently. So I was wondering, Zakiya and Ebony, would you be able to talk about some of the environmental justice issues that the city is currently facing related to your work, and what you really see as possible solutions that really focus on both racial equity and climate change?
Sure. So Zakiya and I are actually both part of the city's very first Environmental Justice Commission. It was created by legislation in late 2019. And we're working with a couple of different other organizations on the commission to really evaluate the need in Philadelphia and kind of see, we know generally speaking, like what the issue is, but where are the policy points and the changes that we can make, the small changes that we can make sort of along the way to the bigger changes to mitigate, the issue. So we've been working on that quite a bit. And one of the things that we've been talking about, and something that, I've been working on, is cumulative impacts legislation. And so really cumulative impacts legislation is this idea that has been floating around the country for a very, very, very long time. And it hasn't really successfully been implemented anywhere to my knowledge. And part of that is because it's so complicated. And it's just, the idea though is so simple and it's so logical and it makes so much sense that it makes you wonder, why there's such difficulty getting it to actually come to fruition. But basically, cumulative impacts legislation, and the one that we're specifically working on, would require the city, before engaging in any new permits, to assess a couple of different criteria for communities. So one, and the first full stop, would be a health impacts assessment, whereby the Department of Public Health would develop a health grading scale. And we haven't figured out exactly, what the sort of levels would be in terms of where the parameters would be, whether it would be by zip code or council district. We haven't really figured that out, because that's all dependent on like the data that the Department of Public Health has and what they can make available. But basically, the Department of Public Health would assign a grade to each community. And if the community fell below a certain grade, then there just would not be any more permits allowed in that community. So that would be the first sort of stop. And the reason that we wanted to include something like a health impacts analysis is because of the fact that environmental racism causes health disparities, right? And even with gentrification and folks moving around and income changing and demographics changing in communities, health is still going to be one of the biggest indicators of where the problems are. And so the second sort of analysis would be the cumulative impacts analysis, which would require the city to conduct a cumulative impacts analysis in environmental justice communities, or what the what DEP, Department of Environmental Protection in Pennsylvania, has defined as an environmental justice community. And in Pennsylvania, DEP basically says that an EJ community is one where either 30% or more of the population is living at or below the poverty line, or is a member of a racial minority. And so what that means for Philadelphia is that pretty much all of Philadelphia is considered an EJ community based on that scale, which is, interesting. And so we really wanted to have a couple of different mechanisms that I guess would almost be fail-proof, in the sense of there's a lot of development happening in Philadelphia. There's a lot of movement. There's a lot of flexibility in terms of who's going where and what the demographics are looking like. And we didn't really want the city to be able to say, oh, well, Southwest was, technically an EJ community, but there's a lot of development happening there. And so it's not as big of an issue. So we can just now throw all of our, situations down in that area of the community. So we're working on that legislation, and we have a lot of support for it, honestly, in city council. And that's historically been the biggest hurdle, because it is a pretty radical sort of regulation, but we're pretty optimistic that we can get something passed. And the complicated part of it is the actual development of a standard. And that's kind of where, things are always as left, because, you can sort of logically say, oh, well, it makes sense for the regulating agency to look at the totality of emissions in a community before they decide to, issue another permit. But then the question becomes, well, how do you actually do that in practice? So that's sort of the aspect that we're working on right now.
Thank you for calling in the EJ Commission. I think one of the most important things that is moving forward is trying to figure out new pathways for people to be more involved in decision making. And over the last several years, the challenges that people face when advocating for their communities has really impacted people's abilities to make changes in their own communities. Like, I'm thinking about the Nicetown gas plant that really mobilized residents in Nicetown around pushing back on a combined heat and power plant that our transit agency was using as a resiliency strategy. And they really ran into a lot of challenges with really pushing forward this narrative around centering people and centering how this community has just been overburdened by pollution for years over, this institution's long-term resiliency plan, and how there needs to be other changes made. And so I'm really hopeful, and I feel really great about being part of the environmental justice working group to create the commission as another pathway for folks to be a part of decision making. And that's also like a huge part of my job, is to carve out and just create our own spaces for decision making. So I also think that energy will remain being a really critical issue in Philadelphia, especially as climate change continues to advance. People are using less energy, right? And so being that we have the largest publicly owned natural gas utility here in Philadelphia, we're going to see more asks around trying to increase our prices because we're using less energy, and that's going to disproportionately impact low income Black and brown communities. And now that the city has its carbon neutrality goal by 2050, it's really put in the pressure on for us to figure out how are we going to move forward, and how are we going to make decisions around the future of a utility by centering the workers as well, who will be impacted by any changes, as well as like what protections need to be made for low-income folks. And like I mentioned, this is directly tied to this whole national trend around electrification. And so a huge part of my work is really trying to bring together all these different people who are focused on housing, on energy burdens, on utility advocacy, to really come together around this issue, because it has broader implications. It also has to do with how are we going to advance housing repairs and energy efficiency, and it's a huge task. So Philadelphia Climate Works and Green Building United, we are forming a coalition and working group called Here for CJ, Housing Equity, Repair and Electrification for Climate Justice, really bringing those folks together to work on this and to start pushing the city to make those decisions with the people who are going to be impacted. Some other environmental justice issues here in Philadelphia, we're still going to feel the impacts of the recently closed Philadelphia Energy Solutions. There's a lot of questions around how we're going to move forward with that land and what to do with that pollution. And also we're still dealing with pollution period. So like diesel pollution, while transportation electrification is, you know, I don't think that should be our priority right now with our funding. But with our funding constraints and COVID issues, we really need to make long-term plans on how to start reducing all of these burdens on our communities. And we also need to start bringing in the workers, I think, because one of my issue areas with Philadelphia Climate Works has really been around like supporting sanitation workers and trying to push for a transition of their fleet, and like bus drivers and bus maintenance workers and sanitation workers and all these workers who use this dirty infrastructure, they're majority Black and like low paid workers. And so it's a racial economic justice issue. It's a environmental justice issue in terms of who's impacted by these vehicles being placed on the road in their communities and their transfer stations, et cetera. And so there's just a lot of issues and a lot of opportunity here in Philadelphia for people to be involved and for people to start sharing their ideas and their stories. And I'm looking forward to it. So anybody in Philadelphia who's ready to tackle these issues with us, we need your help.
Great, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what we as, you know, both lawyers and citizens can do in a little bit. But before we turn there, I did want to touch on, like, right now is a really exciting moment. We're seeing huge grassroots activism around issues of environmental justice and climate justice. You know, there's a real awakening of a lot of people to the huge racial injustices that, you know, are prevalent in society. We're seeing a lot of action on climate change at the, you know, local, city, state level. We're also probably going to be seeing more climate legislation or action from a federal level. Some of these, as some of you mentioned, are more market-based solutions where, you know, Pennsylvania's joining RGGI, cap and trade system for electricity market emissions. I know New York City has passed a building emissions law, and there's talk of a cap and trade policy on there. So kind of turning to, like, you know, future climate legislation, I'm wondering, you know, what is working? How is environmental justice really being incorporated, or how is it not? And what are ways that you guys are working to make sure that it is a priority in these areas?
I'll just briefly brag a little bit about New York State, who passed the Climate Leadership Protection Act last year. And, you know, while it wasn't the perfect law, it was as close as we've seen, and we're pretty jazzed about it. A lot still remains to be done in terms of implementation, in terms of identifying how the ambitious goals are going to be met across the board, and in terms of identifying what is called the disadvantaged communities that are to get the proceeds and benefits of the transitions to not fossil fuel based energy economies. And those conversations have been very, very interesting and fascinating, and I think are really we see and we hope informing what's happening at the federal level now. I think that there is a bill that either came out or is coming out in Congress about EJ mapping, and it's the same sort of how do we screen and identify communities that moving forward should be getting the 40% of the benefits and from renewable transitions, as the Biden administration has endorsed and stated that they intend to do. And that 40% number, we were thrilled to see again, is coming directly and mirroring directly the CLCPA. And so I think that New York, for better or for worse, will be a bit of a teaching process. And we've had some stumbles, but it's, in terms of process, there is a real effort to include many representatives, leaders, and organizers from environmental justice communities, as well as organizations, in the Climate Action Council and the advisory committees that are advising the Climate Action Council, who is in charge of implementing the CLCPA. So we're moderately hopeful, but part of that is also just continuing to really push for accountability, transparency, meeting of deadlines and benchmarks. And there is new legislation that we're going to be pushing to be passed, which is the Climate and Communities Investment Act, which gives a lot more meat to the notion of the investments that need to be made in disadvantaged communities, and sort of puts more meat on the bones that were set forth in the CLCPA. So that, I don't know if that kind of gives a little peek as to what we can anticipate or expect nationally, but it is exciting.
I can offer some things that I think are making me hopeful. I think one, from a process standpoint, we're seeing climate action planning happening on a local level. We're seeing kind of an evolution of the process of climate action planning, from a climate action plan to a climate justice action plan. I'm actually sitting in Providence, Rhode Island today, and their Providence's climate planning process was very much rooted in justice and rooted in not just procedural justice in terms of having an inclusive process that was the diverse and represented communities most affected, but also thinking about kind of redistributive justice in terms of kind of what are our and transformative justice in terms of kind of how do we change systems as we're preparing to adapt for and mitigate impacts of climate change. How do we also think about redressing past harm through that process in terms of kind of restorative justice? And so that, and the ability to do that at a local level where there's really local accountability, it's very a kind of very different approach than, say, 10 years ago with the Greenworks planning that was happening in Philadelphia, which was on the cutting edge in terms of asking questions of equity and having equity metrics, but didn't have the same kind of thoughts around, what is the role and centering justice. And then the other thing that I just, I can't not mention the sort of flipping of the script that the introduction of the Green New Deal conversation has had. I think we're now in this place where there's still this question of like, well, is Green New Deal viable? Are we going to be able to pass it given the makeup of the Senate? And does Biden support it? But it sort of misses the point that the Green New Deal really is rooted in a whole set of climate justice movements that have come before and led to that moment. And through the introduction of the resolution and all of the popular education that's happened around it, has given us a very different, much more holistic view of where we can be headed. And that is a rights-based approach and and really centers positive rights, and the notion of, a climate justice approach that also centers the right to a living wage and the right to clean water. It's a very different way of having a conversation about approaching the climate crisis than where we were.
Ebony or Zakia, do you have any thoughts to add about current, climate justice, environmental justice policies and pushes for legislation?
I think Melissa and Amy Laura did a really good job of sort of explaining my thoughts, but I do want to sort of expound upon something that Amy Laura mentioned, and that is the fact that there does seem to be more local movement around climate change policy, or it's sort of local ways to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And that to me has always been kind of the key, because it just makes more sense, of course, because a lot of the impacts of climate change are going to be felt by lower income and communities of color. And, local legislation historically is better suited to sort of address some of those more granular issues. And I'm also just really optimistic, given the new federal administration that we have, that things will get done and get done well. There's already been a lot of talk. Biden has tapped some really, really, really great environmental leaders already. A lot of losses in the environmental community, sort of the public interest environmental community, are going to be wonderful for the national environmental justice movement. So I'm really just excited to kind of see what happens nationally, and even more optimistic about what's happening locally. We've been doing for years, really started by Amy Laura actually, work around local green space in Philadelphia, preserving and protecting Philadelphia's gardens, and encouraging the city to implement more proactive policies and legislation around preserving green space. And we know that green space and grass and trees are, huge mitigators of the impacts of climate change, the urban heat island effect. So we're, just going to continue doing that work. And there does seem to be more of an understanding of that sort of nuanced issue, not just at a local level, but even at a state level. We're working with the state right now on legislation aimed at reducing the statutory period for adverse possession, which I'm super excited about. So currently the statutory period for adverse possession is 21 years, which is a really long time if you kind of look statistically around the country at what the statutory period is for other states. So we've been working with legislators on an exemption that basically would reduce it to 10 years specifically for green space. And of course, there would be parameters to make sure that developers can kind of come in and take advantage of this legislation. But there seems to be a more of a movement towards policies to protect and preserve green space as more people understand, the benefits that green space have for mitigation of climate change. So I'm just optimistic and excited.
Yeah, and I really don't have much to add to these amazing answers. I would just say that I'm most excited for us to really start diving into what a just transition really means in practice. I really believe that it means that we're committing to people, that we're committing to protecting the whole wellness of communities. And so, I'm happy with the new administration. I think that, my work remains the same as before, and so does everybody's on a local level, but that hopefully the new administration and the policies and the funding will help open the doors so we can really address some of the major obstacles of reaching our goals here in Philadelphia. So I remain committed to climate justice here in Philadelphia, to bringing folks together to figure out solutions, because I believe that when opportunities come to us from the federal government, from the state, from regional efforts, that we be ready with what we know we need in our communities. We have built the relationships. We know what the issues are. We know what the solutions need to look like for it to actually work locally. And so I'm excited to continue working, and I'm excited for the transformation in cities and states and in other decision-making institutions where they're really starting to understand why environmental justice is so necessary in every part of the institution.
One thing I want to add, just referencing what Ebony was saying in terms of people that we were just tapped to join the Biden administration. I mentioned earlier, that I'm heading to Vermont Law School. I am doing so because the amazing Marian Engelman Lotto has joined EPA. She's a fierce civil rights advocate, and she, amongst a whole set of advocates, have really been pushing for EPA to finally actively engage in civil rights enforcement as a tool of environmental justice. And EPA has dug in its heels for decades on this issue. And so this is one of those moments where we are really kind of waiting. And, you know, as you said, Zakiya, we don't stop doing the work that we've been doing, but there is real potential for partnership with the agency on this, and a potential. And, you know, there's all sorts of proactive work we have to do on climate, but we need that enforcement mechanism in part to make sure that anything that we do that's proactive does not have disproportionate effects on communities of color, and also redress much of the past harm that persists. So, you know, particularly because this is a legal and law student audience, I want to note that, you know, keep an eye on civil rights enforcement.
Great, thank you all so much. I wanted to turn more to what, you know, people both in the legal field and just as citizens can really do. You know, both folks who want to really focus on environmental law or who have practices in other areas. What are ways that we all can be really centering environmental justice and racial justice in our work?
You know, that's always the $1 million question, right? And it's one that is kind of hard to answer, honestly, because I think what we should all be doing, no matter sort of what your role is in society, what your title is, what your job is making sure that things are equitable and calling out injustice when you see injustice, whether that be, you know, your summer associateship at a large firm. If you see, you know, some huge inequity happening, make sure to call it out. Don't just, you know, sit there and watch it happen. But that's, you know, I think a lot of times, especially for law students, you feel like that's easier said than done. But it really is that simple in terms of pushing the ball forward and making people accountable for what they're doing. Is until you're in the position where you can, you know, be the one writing the legislation or pushing for the legislation and, you know, making the change, it's important to call out the injustice when you see the injustice. And I will always say, this is always my biggest piece of advice: support grassroots organizations, support the people who are doing this work. If you are, you know, a law student and you're looking for some pro bono hours, reach out to some of your local grassroots organizations and see if they have needs, see if they, you know, have any research that they need done, see if they have an issue that keeps popping up that you might be able to help them find a legal solution for. Even if you know, yourself as a law student can't, you know, fix the situation, you can help point them to someone who might be able to, or connect them to resources. So that's always my biggest piece of advice: support the people who are on the ground doing the work, first and foremost.
I mean, that's incredible advice. I could talk in like a separate panel about this kind of thing, and especially for law students who say, you know, I want eventually to have a career that's adjacent to some of what the four of us get to do and have the privilege of doing. And I will say, you know, there's no one way and there's no one route to do this kind of work. And there isn't even if you're not at an organization that has an environmental justice practice, that doesn't mean that you can not do this kind of work. If you're at a law firm, my organization, New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, we have a pro bono clearinghouse where small startups, community organizations with needs for legal representation or advice come to the clearinghouse, and the clearinghouse matches lawyers at firms to do pro bono work for these small community organizations. And a lot of that more and more is environmental justice related kind of work. A lot of it includes not just litigation and not just regulatory, but some transactional, some project financing for community owned solar, for example. So there are lots of ways and lots of needs and minds in this world, and ways to get to be a part of solving the many, many problems. The problems aren't going anywhere. A lot of the work that I do, like Zakia, is related to waste. And we always say, for the time being, there's always going to be garbage. So there's always going to be a need to deal with our systemic issues in terms of how we handle our waste. The same way that waste is not the only EJ issue that has been around and is not going anywhere. These issues are always going to be here. So different skill sets, different perspectives, and different talents from different places are needed. So just if you're not going to be an EJ lawyer, that doesn't mean you can't contribute and your contribution isn't going to be valuable.
I really have to agree with Melissa and Ebony here. One of the first pieces of advice that I always give people is to just find your people, find your community. That could be other students, that could be, recognizing that, oh, I live in this neighborhood and I don't know what's going on. I don't know who my block captain is. I've never joined a meeting with my community organization. You should do those things and just stay in touch with people and really be a part of the community. You could also join a coalition like mine, Philadelphia Climate Works. We have lawyers who join for to stay updated, to find ways to help, and to also just be in community, right? Because there might be an opportunity that you would see that we don't see, right? Here's a tool that we could use in this one instance. And here's how I could contribute to us writing these comments, or maybe there's an opportunity here to, I don't know, to be able to force climate, right, into being considered. And I don't know, we just need your insight. And the easiest way to do that is to have those relationships in place. So trying to stay connected to folks, I would say, is a really important way to move forward.
Great, thank you all so much. And we'll move to audience questions now. There's one in the chat that I think a lot of folks already touched on, but it's about the new administration. Biden administration made a lot of really great promises, but we have seen promises be broken in the past, and a lot of candidates have fallen short, especially on issues of the environment and on racial justice. So do any of you have any more thoughts on that? Is there more reason to hope now, and how can we really continue pushing the Biden administration to really follow up on their promises? I know we already touched on it too, so if you think you've said all you can, we can move on to the next question as well.
I guess I could say a couple of things. I mean, I feel like I did, but a couple of things come to mind that signal some sense of change. One is, if you look at the Biden transition, even just looking at the Biden transition website, and kind of how the framing is around the appointments, he appointed a climate team. Nobody's ever had a climate team before. So like just the dialogue around climate is very different, and seeing kind of holistically the kind of relationship between the different agencies, and the notion of this being a sort of, I guess, forgive the sports metaphor, but the sort of full court press on climate issues, and also the notion, and also the really early environmental justice executive order that also points to a kind of whole government approach, and that this is not something; these are not siloed issues. So I think that there's, even since the Obama administration, there's been a real sort of shift in terms of how we conceive of these issues, what we're centering, and who is in the room, and how the conversations have changed around climate, around racial justice, around EJ, and around who's accountable. So it still remains to be seen, but but it's a different conversation.
Yeah, and just, the opportunities that we have with resuming the White House, but also having both chambers of Congress at the same time. I mean, and I'm hoping it's not just 2 years, but for these 2 years, the opportunity to get a lot done and make movement is huge. And it's something we haven't had in a really long time. And I don't think this country has felt the urgency like this in a really long time. I think in some ways, the pandemic keeping us all home really brought more awareness to what was going on in California with the fires and, the extreme weather events that we're seeing. There was no escaping it this past year because everyone was home watching the news. And so there's a little bit more of this notion of mainstreaming of the urgency and the crisis and calling it what it is, a crisis, and having the opportunity of not just having this administration, which is starting to put its, it's all talk, but they're starting to put their money where their mouth is by these appointments and by signing these orders and by using the words environmental justice for a national task force. I mean, my jaw dropped when I saw that. So those things are our reason for hope. And, the one thing that I didn't get to say to answer the last question is the one thing everyone can do and continue to do is vote in every election, because it's not just president, it's not just congressman, it's your local city council members, it's your local school board members who decide, are we going to electrify our school bus fleets, which Zakia mentioned, where are the school bus depots? They're in EJ communities. And so there are choices that are made on the hyper local level that can impact environmental justice, climate and climate justice decision making. So, it seems like cliche, but voting really matters, and knowing and educating yourself about the issues locally and hyper locally really matters too.
Thank you so much. We just got another question. Are there any learnings or takeaways that we can get from international policies and goals to apply to our community, especially given that, there are other countries that appear at least to be far ahead of us on a national level? Okay.
I can jump in, but I was waiting to see if other folks want to. So I will start, but I think the bottom, I think absolutely in terms of climate leadership, there are many other countries and the EU that are kind of ahead of the game on many of the issues that we're grappling with. I would say that I feel like I'm not an expert to be able to to sort of rattle off names, but I know that there are other countries globally that are really moving the ball, pushing the ball ahead, and in terms of the technologies and also in terms of goals and enforceable goals. There also have been more successful. There's been more successful litigation in places like the Netherlands, for example, to push for more ambitious and aggressive enforceable goals around climate change. I think we also have, there are also different local models that we can be looking at, and some of that's about actually looking in our own country in terms of what's happening on a local level, that where there are lessons to be learned, but also, really exchanging kind of lessons learned globally. One of the things that I was looking at for a project that we've been embarked on through the Conservation Law Foundation in Lawrence, Massachusetts, was looking at how the city of Bologna in Italy has a city as commons approach. And so really, they look at public resources as commons resources, and so which means two things. One is, I mean, it probably means more than that, but two important things. One, from a process perspective, that residents of Bologna actually have a voice in how those resources are used, because they are owned in they are held in common by the people, and also that residents can also say, like, oh, here is an actual tangible resource. I have the ability to say, like, even if it's just, say, a conference room in a municipal building, I have the ability as a resident to say, like, this could be useful to me in a particular way from a community perspective, and I have access to be able to, I have access to that. And so I think there are some, being able to kind of get outside of our sort of normal ways of thinking and pull in notions like, well, what does it mean if the city is a commons? What does it mean in terms of public land, green space, and all of those conversations we've been having in Philly for many years? What does that mean in terms of, like, water and energy resources? What does that mean in terms of deciding what the former Sunoco site, the Philadelphia Energy Solutions site, should be used for ongoing? Like, should that actually be a decision that is made by collectively by the people that are most impacted by it? So I think we definitely have lessons to learn, and being able to sort of get outside ourselves is helpful.
Great, thank you so much for that, Amy Laura. We have another question. What are your thoughts on the use of disparate impact litigation under the Civil Rights Act? And do you have any hope that with the new administration, we might be able to overturn the Sandoval statutorily to give people more access to the courts for claims? Would you see this as useful?
Take it, Ebony.
That was me praying and hoping. Very, very, very hopeful that is a thing that we can do during this administration. It would make such a huge difference in our ability to actually get relief for EJ communities, because one of the things that I struggle with the most in my work is actually coming up with viable legal solutions to provide relief through litigation, anything other than legislation, to communities. And one thing that we've been relying on a lot lately is nuisance law, which is helpful. It's not perfect, and it's complicated, and it requires more of a piecemeal approach than we would like. And you're really just putting out fires. So with nuisance, using nuisance law as a tool to combat environmental injustice, really you're identifying an issue, identifying a specific defendant, and then a lot of times the remedy is, sometimes it's temporary, sometimes you can get a permanent injunction, but often it's temporary relief. And we've been trying to use it in a more, I guess, voluminous fashion to deter bad actors from repeating the same behavior, but it really is not the best tool that we have. Well, I guess it technically is the best tool that we have in our toolbox, but if we were able to overturn Sandoval and really get some good things going around disparate impact, that would just make such a huge difference in our ability to actually make change in environmental justice communities. So please, fingers crossed, everyone.
I want to just second and endorse and cheer and pray and add my positive energy to those prayers, because we're all hoping. And again, all of us have been involved in some way or another trying to make sure that any proposed legislation, even over the last few years that was being drafted at the national level, included a Sandoval fix. And again, now that not only do we have the White House, but we have the Senate and Congress and the House, there is a chance that we can actually pass a Sandoval fix, which tomorrow would not be soon enough, in my opinion. Just this week, I was involved in a meeting with some community members who were looking for some legal options to stop the expansion of a natural gas pipeline And it's through predominantly Black and Brown communities in Brooklyn. And, you know, without the hoops you have to jump through currently to file a Title VI complaint to the EPA. Amy Laura can talk about them because she just filed a very powerful one. And the amount of time it takes to get any sort of response, much less an investigation, much less an actual productive response to the community, it's not even worth it for the community members who are looking for something now. But what I will say, also having filed nuisance cases and being frustrated with them, is that the filing of a nuisance case in and of itself isn't the perfect tool, but it's a great community organizing tool because it really can get a community mobilized around you know, an action and a filing and a lawsuit. And it really gives the character, it gives the defendant, and it gives the plaintiff, and it sets the stage. And that is actually very good for community organizing, which often in and of itself can accomplish a lot of the goals through community organizing that we're having trouble accomplishing through litigation. And my final piece is that in New York City, we're lucky we have the New York City Human Rights Law, which does give a disparate impact cause of action, which I brought a class action in a non-traditional environmental justice case, but race-based discrimination in the manner that after-school sports teams are allocated to public school students in New York. And that is a disparate impact case, which we're able to do because local law actually has given us a way to bring that. Of course, it's not in federal court, so you're stuck in state court, which is a whole other thing. But yes, let's hope for the Sandoval fix. But in the interim, all hope is not lost, but it would be much easier with the Sandoval fix.
Thank you. That was great. For the very last question, we're almost out of time, but we'll go from like very specifics to very broad with the last question, which is, can environmental justice be attained with capitalism? Any last closing thoughts?
Just have a simple answer, a short answer. I don't think so. Capitalism requires exploitation, and we are trying to redress exploitation through environmental justice. So not for me. What do other folks think?
I think that the answer is probably not, but my hope and my understanding is that I think we're unfortunately a long way from getting rid of capitalism. So I hope that we can inch as close as possible to environmental justice as we can get in the structure that we're sort of relegated to be within at this point in time.
Go for it, Melissa.
I was just going to say, and continue to call out false solutions that are, you know, tied to capitalism, like cap and trade, and other, you know, other wolves in sheep's clothing. But that was my only addition.
And I think, and this is one of those moments where I'm speaking on my own behalf and not behalf of an organization, because this is a hard one. It's a hard one it's hard to kind of step outside of where we are. And so I think about it in two ways. One is, are we relying on market-based solutions as our way out of a problem? And the logic of that is to me often very circular, because that takes us back to we're sort of cementing ourselves in systems that are the origin of the problem and the origin of inequity. And so if in general, if we're not willing to kind of call out injustice and call out inequity and look for solutions that dismantle that and kind of reshape where we are, then we're building the same we're building the same systems all over again. I think the question of are we looking at a different are we looking at dismantling capitalism and kind of getting to the other side of it? That's a kind of much longer conversation, much longer project. But I think at least at the very start, let's look at what are we relying on as the systems that we are changing and the systems that we want in place. And I think the reliance on market-based solutions as a way of getting ourselves out of current out of the climate crisis and out of current inequities will end up embedding us straight back in the same places that we're in great part because those solutions don't center the people who are most affected. They don't center people of color, and they don't allow those voices in the conversation. So, and I say that on behalf of my own damn self, because it's a hard one.
Great. And on that note, thank you all so much for joining us today. I know I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure everyone else did. And I think we all also recognize that for all of us, this is just a starting point. And there's so much work that we have to continue to do. And it seems like from the comments, people are already interested in learning more about and finding ways to support local grassroots organizations tackling these issues. So thank you again for everyone who attended, and a special thanks to the panelists.
Yeah, I'll just echo Sage. I'm so deeply grateful for our panelists and for your time and the work you do and for your insights. I learned so much, and I hope our attendees can say the same. A quick CLE note, if you are an attendee seeking CLE credit, I know there was some confusion about the polls. So the code words were river and stream, both singular. So make sure you fill out your digital evaluation form that was emailed to you. And if you don't have it, please find the link to the evaluation form in the chat so that you can get credit for attending. And again, thank you so much. We had at our peak 65 attendees, which is amazing that so many people are interested in learning more about environmental justice and the pursuit of it. So with that, thank you all so much for being here, especially to our panelists. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, y'all.